I'm not coming from an archaeological perspective, but I thought I'd try and bond with the top picture here. And I am actually handily following on slightly from the last presentation, and then I'm talking about looting, or the consequences of looting. So repatriation, in museum terms, means the returning of artefacts or human remains to their country or people of origin. I'm from the World Cultures Department in a museum, which formerly was ethnography, so I'm talking about other countries, I'm not talking about the UK. And why is repatriation important to the people who originally owned or were related to these items? It's mostly about, these days, I suppose you could say it's about truth and reconciliation, about closure. Oddly, people, generally speaking, are all that happy about being colonised, and it can have been quite a traumatic experience historically. People have lost a lot, and maybe lost a lot of their material culture. So to have things returned helps to do all of these things up there, and particularly human remains. We're often talking about blood ancestors, blood relatives that are in museums all over the world. We're not talking about stratigraphic excavation at all, and looting has gone on for centuries, particularly from the 17th century onwards, when the rest of the world was Europe's playground, Northern Europe's playground. In terms of the history of cultural repatriation, I think it really began before, in terms of empowerment, from 1972 with the UNESCO Convention on the rights of indigenous peoples. But in Australia, indigenous communities have been trying to campaign for their rights ever since they were allowed to be classified as human beings in the late 1960s. And in the United States in particular, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, empowered an awful lot of communities, indigenous communities, to step forward and start asking for things back. And UK museums began to receive requests for repatriation from about the mid-1980s. The first UK repatriation came in 1997, when the necklace belonging to the last Tasmanian Aboriginal, Truganini, was returned from Exeter Museum. Truganini and her necklace and a bracelet ended up in the UK. Scottish museums, we have a different legal system from England, just as you know. And really, repatriation as a whole is quite complex. It's very emotional. It's very difficult to be objective about it. There's a lot of ethical issues, a lot of legal and political issues as well. The requests are usually initiated by indigenous communities in former colonised nations of Europe, which includes the UK. And in particular, they come from the US, some extent from Canada, New Zealand and Australia. They're instigated by those governments. Museums in general are quite passive, and they act only when approached. That's just the way it is. So, as I said, we have different legal systems. So I'm going to mostly talk about Scotland. That's where I've come from. I come from Glasgow. And England also has a Human Tissues Act, 2004. But the Scottish Act doesn't specifically cover museum collections. And human remains are considered to be a separate category from other items. Scots law does not recognise the concept of property when it comes to human remains. And unless they've been treated, and become artefacts, like worked bone, for instance. And we can still continue to formally add human remains to the collection if they can be held lawfully, if you've got established provenance, and if there's no implication of illicit trade. That sometimes people will donate their bodies to museums. Those are normally people within the UK. I've been in posts for 14 years and nobody's ever offered human remains, or in that time, to our museum. Cultural artefacts are different because they are property. Right, and that's where things get difficult. In terms of repatriation, it's quite easy to give back human remains. It's quite easy to justify it. It's quite easy not to justify keeping them, actually. But in terms of objects, this seems to be some kind of cultural issue with Scottish and probably British as a general rule. Museums and governing bodies, trustees, don't really like to let things go. So a number of guidelines are followed. They are guidelines. There's no law regarding this. You have to just sort of let go. So there's a bit of, And in terms of our museums, these are all the things that people worry about. And this is usually our trustees, sometimes the public. In Glasgow, the public owns the collections. So people will come up and say there's going to be, and I've done so many interviews, television interviews about, will the floodgates be opened? We're going to lose our collections. Well, Glasgow has 1.5 million objects in the collection, so it's not really going to make much of a dent. Now, in terms of where this material comes from, our World Cultures collections, formerly ethnography collections, are of non-European provenance. I'm the curator of everything that's not Europe. And we have 23,000 objects. The collection was normally known as ethnography, and most of them come from the colonial period, and are often called colonial collections these days. At that time, Glasgow was considered itself to be the second city of the empire. And most of this collection was made by British migrant missionaries, soldiers, adventurers. So there we have actually Kelvin Grove during one of the great international exhibitions, which was, promoting empire, really. There on the right, you have David Livingstone being attacked by a lion. He did contribute quite a lot of artefacts to the collections. He was a missionary. There is a man, or a couple of men in topis looking at a native person, observing, and then probably going to remove that musical instrument from that boy's hands to put in a museum. And the other person is a missionary called John Arthur with his Kikuyu friends from the Scottish Presbyterian Mission in Kenya. Things have changed, so there have been a sort of gradual shift in our moral perspective, and we're far more, we're much more cuddly and inclusive, and we talk about these days multiculturalism and equality, dialogue, cooperation, inclusion, and consultation, but we do still have the collections. Here we have a more recent acquisition illustrating all of these issues. A painting which every museum, presumably Manchester has one too, by the Singh twins from Liverpool, which is called Mr. Singh's India, which is actually the name of a restaurant in Glasgow, showing lots of sort of mutual interests. Now, Glasgow's first repatriation was to Mount Morgan in North Queensland. We'd acquired human remains in 1889 and 1896. I'm not going to show images of the human remains. These are human remains that are sort of historic. People are related to them. Living people are related to them. I think it's out of respect. I don't know how you don't feel about having your grandmother's skull photographed up there. So what I'm showing is the gifts or sort of associated objects that were related to the repatriation ceremonies. So this was actually the first repatriation from a Scottish museum. Then I'm just going to run through quickly the Glasgow's association with repatriation. So the next one came along in 1994. It was the claim for a waistcoat belonged to the Hunkpapa warrior, who supposedly killed Sitting Bull, Rain in the Face. And this was rejected because it was regarded more as a kind of spoliation claim, which is basically a request from a family member. It doesn't have any community associations. But this has gone on, actually. This has continued to be a claim that comes in every now and again from two sources. Rain in the Face was born in Cheyenne River Reservation and died in Standing Rock. And so both of these communities every now and again put a claim forward. Which my personal opinion is that if people want something badly enough and they have a good, they should get it back, really. We do have 1.5 million objects, and this waistcoat isn't on display. The next rejected claim were Benin bronzes from part of a massive haul that the British took from their punitive exhibition. Sorry, that's a that's a typo. It was an expedition to Benin City. They were quite good at it, the British. There were quite a few punitive expeditions. And generally speaking, the people who lost, which were almost always, in fact, inevitably, the people who were being punished, had to pay for their own sins and give over everything of value, which in this case were the Benin bronzes. And that was rejected for a number of reasons, which I won't go into, but partly because the claim was instigated by a British MP called Bernie Grant, who actually died in the course of this, and nobody's taken it up since. Right, the big one, which went on for 5 years, was the Lakota ghost dance shirt. This was an item that came from the body of a Sioux warrior, a Lakota Sioux warrior, that was killed at the Battle of Wounded Knee, and it was returned after a long time and many appeals to the Wounded Knee Survivors Association in Pine Ridge Reservation. So just as you know, quick background. The Wounded Knee Creek, 1890, December 29th, the US Army, with their Hotchkiss cannons, managed to massacre 300 at least Lakota women, children and warriors, and 25 US cavalry died. So that's quite a disturbing picture. So this is the sort of thing, people would wander onto battlefields. This is not the only battlefield, and would remove clothing from the dead and flog it to museums. So the shirt itself came via Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The survivors were rounded up. Some of them were imprisoned in Fort Worth. But a lot of them had already been performing with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and he came along and took 25 of them. The 25 agreed to go to Europe with him on a tour. One of them was Kicking Bear, whose ghost dance song, the ghost dance was actually a religion, which if anybody wants to know about it, you can ask me later. And he turned up as well. He was one of the performers. That's the performers. I mean, this is probably really didn't really help with post-traumatic stress, in that they had to reenact pretty much the battle which they'd left less than a year before, over and over and over again. George Krager, who in the top photo is the 4th person in the top row from the left. George Krager was the interpreter for the Lakota people. He was a kind of a bit of a con man, stroke journalist, stroke just general white boy. He sold a collection of artefacts, including the ghost dance shirt and 4 other items from Wounded Knee, he said, to Glasgow Museum. So that's where we got it from to start with. So after at the return ceremony, and the return came about as a public hearing. The people of Glasgow who own the collection agreed to the return in 1998. It was finally returned in 1999. And Marcella Lebeau, who's the lady on the right-hand side, who was the secretary of the Wounded Knee Survivors Association, made a modern shirt, which she insists is not a replica. And that is on display permanently at Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow with the story. And she's basically, I shake your hand with a good heart, as a Lakota way of saying thanks. So the influence of that repatriation meant that up till 1998 there were no policies or guidelines. We just kind of dealt with it, and it was a little bit chaotic. Then since 1998, Glasgow City Council has a sort of repatriation of artefacts working group established, which meets as and when. And each case is considered on a case-by-case basis. And those are the conditions. There are 5 conditions. One of interest, slightly contentious, is the fate of the object is returned. I think that if you give something back that you've taken unlawfully, you don't really set conditions as to what you do with that object. And it causes some fact. The ghost dance shirt is not with the Lakota people at all. It's in another museum because they did not have on the reservations they didn't have suitable display conditions, museum conditions. So it's now in another museum within the US. So since the ghost dancer, there have been no requests for the repatriation of artefacts. Certainly not since 2000, not anything seriously. People do write, so people nowadays, they send me messages on Facebook, but it's rare that things are followed up. There have been requests for the return of ancestral remains, human remains, particularly to New Zealand and Australia, because there has been an agreement between the UK and Australian government in particular in 2000 between Tony Blair and the then Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard. And New Zealand, the National Museum of New Zealand has a really active repatriation programme for human remains. So again, no human remains. A lot of people in the press thought these two items were actually being repatriated, but they were just kind of a humanish things that we could display. So there is a repatriation of 3 tattooed preserved heads called toi moko and 1 leg bone. So Maori Tonga returned to Papa Museum in 2005, 2006 and 2009, unprovenanced human remains going from Australian Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander origin, going back. That was a smudging ceremony which was held right next to our totem pole. That's why some of us are looking a bit anxious. So we managed to get the elder to go outside eventually. We didn't really want to set the museum on fire. 2007, human remains, 5 skulls that were collected for scientific research, in inverted commas, by the Cambridge professor Alfred Court Haddon in 1898. They went back to the Torres Strait, they went back to Canberra. Again, there are other issues from the community's perspective. So that's but Ron Day, the chap on the top picture on the right-hand side, turned out to be related to one of those remains, one of those people that were returned. And here's a list of all the repatriations from Scottish museums ever. So it's not that many, just in case there's anybody here who feels that we are going to open any floodgates. The most recent was a Maori war flag from the Maori Wars that was was repatriated. The decision was made in 2015. It was actually repatriated in last October. So, as I mentioned, there are issues. People, I've looked at our perspective from the community's perspective, and we're talking about people who, generally speaking, might not necessarily have resources, financial resources, to go through all of the angst and difficulties of actually having objects returned. They may not, they've often left many aspects of their culture behind. That, for instance, the Maori communities in the past would have displayed their toi moko, their heads, in the marae, which they can't do now. They don't. Most of them are Christian. They don't really want mummified heads in their community halls. So it's quite difficult. You can't always identify people. You don't want, and if you have any kind of spiritual connection with your ancestors, you do want the correct ancestors in your village and in your graveyard. You don't want to be inadvertently burying someone else. None of our human remains that we've repatriated have actually gone back to any communities. They're all sitting in other museum repositories, admittedly in their country of origin, which I feel is at least a step in the right direction. So, if you're dealing with artefacts, you've got a huge legal battle on your hands. The ghost dance shirt took 5 years to go back. So what can you do? You can consult. You want to make sure that people are getting what they want, and it's led by the community. So you can outreach to that extent and try and work with people, and perhaps help. If you can't send things back, look after them in the way that's culturally appropriate. Glasgow Museum to have what we call a sensitive materials repository, where we keep unprovenanced human remains and sacred artefacts, because quite often it's not just human remains that are sacred and alive, it's often the artefacts to them. So you have to be quite culturally appropriate about this. You cannot, these days, I think, sort of impose your values on other people's cultures. Long-term loans is a possibility. That does happen. The treatment and care of sacred items I mentioned before, that's very important, but also always with consultation, not by reading books. And you can have to reach out and get a response. There's a lot of suspicion and hostility towards museums in many, many indigenous communities. Digitising collections is an easy peasy thing to do, and that's what we do a lot of. I've been involved in two kind of external projects, one digitising Sierra Leonean collections and another with Great Lakes, Canada collections. And that means that people can at least get virtual access. If they then recognise something that they think they should have back, and we can start working with them. Raising awareness amongst the general public about this, here I am today. And also we have, of course, the Ghost Dance shirt on display at Kelvin Grove. And it is easily one of the most popular undergraduate dissertation topics with museum anthropology students by a country mile, I would say. And as I say, dialogue based on cooperation and less on patronage and entitlement. I think we have a lot to answer for, but I personally was not alive at the time of the, and most of us aren't. We all have a sort of a duty, though, to take care of these colonial collections. And finally, we still work very strongly with the Lakota. Some of you be aware of the Standing Rock Dapple pipeline issues that we've gone through recently. It's right in the face, as I said, died at Standing Rock. Some of his descendants have rekindled, if you like, the request for the waistcoat to be returned to empower their youth. But there's an empowered Lakota youth down at the bottom right-hand side. But it helps, all of this helps to give people a sense of cultural identity and to maintain their sense of tradition. The sculpture up at the top was actually based on a pipe that was in former President Andrew Jackson's collection, private collection, and it's a sacred pipe that was taken from the Lakota. But the artist, Charles Rencounter, was sort of scaled it up, and that is now overlooking the pipeline at Standing Rock, or the pipeline route at Standing Rock. So, and that's it really. This paper wasn't anything to do with my research, just my experience. So, thank you very much.